The black belt mocked the janitor in front of everyone until a single step turned the dojo into a silent witness, and the internet would never forget what came next. The mop slid quietly across the lacquered hardwood, its rhythmic swish the only sound left in the gym. It was nearly 9:45 p.m. in Denver, and James Washington, clad in dark overalls and work boots worn smooth at the heel, was finishing his nightly ritual, cleaning the floor after the advanced classes had wrapped. Or so he thought, but that Thursday the class hadn't ended. 8 students lingered on the mat, sweaty and breathless from an extended sparring session. Their instructor, Sensei Derek Mitchell, stood at the center, black belt tied tightly, the fluorescent lights glinting off its embroidered ends like the tip of a sword. James moved quietly along the edge of the mat, careful not to interrupt. He always cleaned this zone last, out of respect, but as he reached near the sparring line, a loud thump echoed. Derek had kicked over the mop bucket. Water spread like a guilty confession across the floor. "Oh, looks like you missed a spot," Derek called out, his tone casual, but his smirk anything but. Laughter fluttered nervously through the group. James didn't flinch. He bent down, picked up the bucket with a quiet calm, and began cleaning the mess. "You got that?" Derek asked, louder this time, ensuring everyone heard. "Wouldn't want anyone slipping. We've got real athletes here tonight." More awkward laughter. James straightened slightly, gave a polite nod, and resumed wiping. He was almost finished when it happened. Derek clapped his hands together and spun dramatically toward James. "Hey, janitor," the word cracked like a whip across the room. James paused. He didn't look up. "Since you're already out here and the mat's clean enough, how about you help us out with a quick demo?" The gym went still, not silent, still, like the air itself had held its breath. Derek paced slowly, theatrically. "You know, just a fun little sparring drill, nothing serious. My students could use a laugh." One of the younger students, a boy barely 18, chuckled under his breath. Another elbowed him to stop. James finally stood upright, hands at his sides, eyes steady but unreadable. "I'm just here to clean, sir, nothing more." Derek raised his eyebrows in mock surprise. "Really? Come on, you walk around here like you know things. Let's see if you can do more than mop the floor." The students shifted uncomfortably. They had seen Derek humiliate newcomers before, but this was different. This wasn't a new white belt. This was a janitor. Someone they barely noticed before now. Someone outside the code. "Let's make it educational," Derek added, pacing like a ringmaster. "Show the class the difference between trained discipline and, well, manual labor." His voice dripped with performative cruelty, and yet he framed it like a lesson, something noble. A black belt teaching humility, he'd say, but no one missed the gleam in his eye. This wasn't about learning. It was about dominance, control. James said nothing. His mop rested quietly against the wall. The bucket was half full, the floor half dry. He looked at the puddle he'd just cleaned, then at the mat where Derek now stood waiting. The gym lights buzzed faintly overhead. Somewhere in the back of the room, a young woman exhaled slowly, her hands clenched in her lap. No one moved, not yet, but the storm had already begun, quietly, without thunder. James reached for the mop without a word, intent on finishing the job and disappearing into the background like he always did. But Derek wasn't finished. "Come on, man. Don't be shy," he said, stepping forward with exaggerated friendliness, the kind that covers a blade. "We're all family here. No need to be embarrassed." A few of the students gathered closer now, drawn by the scent of something they couldn't name, curiosity mixed with discomfort. Their faces shifted between amused and unsure, glancing at each other, waiting to see how far this would go. James gave a slight shake of the head. "Thank you, sir, but I'm not here for that. I'm just trying to finish the floor." He kept his tone level, respectful, but to Derek, the refusal sounded like defiance. "Finish the floor," Derek repeated loudly, as if the words tasted funny in his mouth. "You hear that, everyone? He's got more important things to do than help us improve our form." The laughter that followed wasn't loud. It was thin, strained, like a balloon that wouldn't quite pop. James moved to the edge of the mat again, began rinsing the mop. His back was straight, his hands steady, but he was listening, watching. Derek took a few steps toward him, voice dropping just enough to feel dangerous. You know, I admire that work ethic, honest living and all, but let's be real. Guys like you don't usually get to step on mats like these." The air shifted. Not a single student laughed. Derek smiled wider, pretending it was all still light-hearted. "I mean, no offense. Everyone has a role. Some people train. Some clean." His words landed soft but cut sharp. "That's balance, right?" One of the students, a tall young man with a white belt and too much energy, nudged his friend and whispered just loud enough. "He probably doesn't even know what a fighting stance looks like." That one landed. James paused, hand tightening briefly on the mop handle. His head lifted, eyes resting calmly on the boy who had spoken. Just a glance, nothing more. But the student looked away, suddenly fascinated by his shoelace. Derek caught it too. Something flickered in his eyes just for a second. "All right, I get it," he said, trying to soften. "You're shy, or maybe you're afraid to step on a mat where people earn their respect, not mop it." James said nothing, but the silence was different now. Not passive, not invisible, it had weight. It reached across the gym and settled on everyone's shoulders. One of the older students, a woman in her 40s, frowned. Her arms were crossed and her jaw had tightened. Sarah, sitting near the far wall, didn't speak yet, but her fingers had curled into fists on her lap. Derek, sensing the shift, pushed further. "Come on, just 5 minutes. Show us what you've got. Could be fun." He turned to his class. "Great opportunity to learn, right? Hands-on comparison between training and, well, mopping." The chuckles came again, more forced than before. James wiped one last strip of floor, then stood straight. His eyes didn't flinch, his breath steady. He looked at the mat, then back at Derek. Still not a word. But in that moment, something about him changed. Not physically, not obviously, but subtly, like a wire pulled taut behind his eyes. No one saw it yet, but Sarah felt it. The same way you feel a thunderstorm coming before you ever see the clouds. The water on the floor had spread in a slow, uneven shape, like something bleeding out under the gym lights. James stared at it, the mop still in his hand, but unmoving. The edges of the puddle curled like fingers, creeping toward the center of the mat where Derek stood waiting. It wasn't the mess that held his attention. It was the memory it stirred. It had started like this once. Not in a dojo, but in Las Vegas. The night was loud, cameras flashing, announcers yelling, a title match under the heat of 10,000 eyes. And Tony Rodriguez standing in front of him, smiling through the headgear, their gloves tapping gently in respect. They were sparring, not fighting, just rounds to keep sharp before James's championship defense. Tony had always been faster, but James had something else, a stillness, a timing that made people call him Silent Storm. The nickname had come from a fight in Tokyo, where he knocked out a world champion in less than a minute without breaking rhythm. Reporters said he looked like he was breathing in a temple, not a ring. But that night in Vegas, something had been off. The pressure had been building for weeks. Rumors, sponsorship deals, fans shouting his name but mocking his background. Too clean, too quiet, not enough killer instinct. Someone in the crowd yelled a slur as they entered the cage. James didn't know who. It didn't matter. It landed, like poison in the bloodstream. By round 3, the rhythm broke. He wasn't sparring anymore. He was trying to prove something. He threw a combination that wasn't meant to be thrown in training. 4 moves. The last one, a spinning elbow, landed just as Tony slipped. The angle was wrong. Tony fell hard. His head bounced off the canvas. And then, silence. The kind that doesn't belong in a gym or in life. Tony never opened his eyes again. The commission ruled it a training accident. No charges, no foul play, but James knew he had lost control, not just of his fist, but of everything that made him who he was. He disappeared 2 weeks later, vanished from the rankings, from the cameras, from the world that once celebrated him. Some said he retired undefeated, but he knew better. You don't retire when you lose something that mattered more than belts. You run. Years later, he got the call. His younger sister, Kesha, 17, shot during a police chase in their neighborhood. A stray bullet. Wrong place, wrong time, they said. He was teaching a seminar in Osaka when it happened. He didn't finish the class. He didn't return to America for the funeral. He couldn't, because by then he had already become someone else. Someone smaller, someone quieter. A man who mopped floors and avoided eye contact, not because he was weak, but because he was tired of watching violence hide behind honor, tired of systems that praised him with one hand and erased people like his sister with the other. So he stopped fighting, stopped showing what he could do, not out of fear, but out of choice, out of penance. And yet tonight, in a gym full of echoes and cheap fluorescent lighting, someone was daring him to step back onto a mat. Not with fists, but with pride, and that was a different kind of provocation, one he hadn't faced in a long time. He looked back at the water. The reflection staring up wasn't of a janitor, it wasn't of a fighter. It was of a man who once held power and now questioned if it had ever meant anything at all. Behind him, Derek chuckled again, loud, forced, empty. James didn't move, but something inside him had started to turn. Not anger, not yet, but something colder, sharper, the kind of silence that arrives before a storm remembers how to speak. The silence in the gym wasn't quiet, it was heavy, alive. Derek's last words still lingered in the air like smoke. The world has a place for those who know how to stay in their lane. No one moved, no one breathed. James remained still by the mat, his hands calm at his sides, his eyes unreadable. Derek smiled to himself, mistaking submission for control. That was always his blind spot. At the far edge of the room, Sarah Chun's heart was thudding in her chest. She sat on the wooden bench near the back wall, knees locked, fingers curled against her thighs. She had heard that line before, not those exact words, but the same tone, the same poison wrapped in discipline. 2 years ago, she had tried to speak up, a different student, a similar moment. A quiet brown belt being mocked for his stutter during a demonstration. She had stepped forward, said something simple, "That's not necessary." Derek had turned to her then too, his voice cold, sharp. "You're here to learn, not to question." That night she went home shaking, and she didn't speak up again, until now. "Sensei." The word cut the silence without raising its volume. Heads turned. Derek looked up, surprised. Sarah rose to her feet, her voice steady but low. "Why exactly do you think it's appropriate to humiliate someone who's just doing his job?" There was no challenge in her tone, no anger, just clarity, and that made it land harder. Derek blinked, smile fading slightly. "Excuse me, you said the world has places," she continued, taking a slow step forward. "But are those places based on character or just job titles?" Some students shifted in their stance. A few lowered their eyes. Others watched her like they'd never seen her before. Derek straightened. "Sarah, I suggest you remember who's leading this class." "I haven't forgotten," she said, "but I didn't come here to be taught that respect only flows in one direction." The line hit like a slap in the stillness. For a moment, Derek didn't respond. Then he laughed, brittle and forced. "Let me guess, this is about politics now, or maybe you're just emotional." Sarah felt the sting, but she didn't back down. She had backed down once, and it had haunted her, not because the boy she tried to defend quit the dojo, but because she hadn't. She had stayed, trained, in silence, watching the same patterns repeat, over and over. "No," she said, "this isn't about politics, it's about decency." Her eyes flicked briefly to James. He hadn't moved, but she wasn't speaking for him. She was speaking for herself. For the girl she used to be, the one who stayed quiet. For every moment she let a bully wrap himself in tradition and call it leadership. Derek's face tightened. He opened his mouth, but whatever words he had, they never came. Because the room had shifted, not loudly, not violently, but like the tide. And for the first time, Derek wasn't standing in the center of it. James placed the mop gently against the far wall. The sound of the wooden handle tapping against the concrete echoed louder than it should have. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He stepped away from the bucket like he was stepping out of a skin he had worn too long. Slow, measured, not dramatic, just certain. A few students shifted instinctively. One actually stood halfway before catching himself. He didn't know why. His body had moved before his mind. Derek tried to laugh again, but the sound caught halfway in his throat. James stepped forward, not onto the mat, not yet, just closer. His shoulders rolled slightly. His spine aligned. The angle of his feet changed, subtle but precise. A weight shifted in the room. No one could say why, but everyone felt it. Sarah inhaled, not sharply, not loud, but deep. The kind of breath you take when you realize something's about to happen, not because of what was said, but because of how the air feels before it breaks. James didn't take a stance, not overtly, but his posture changed. The softness in his knees, the balance of his weight, the looseness in his hands, it wasn't casual, it was calculated, and it wasn't for show. Sarah had spent 2 years studying posture and breathing patterns in elite fighters for her thesis. She had logged hours watching Olympic footage, slow-motion breakdowns of pre-contact rituals, the telltale shifts in the center of gravity just before impact. What she saw now was not a janitor. It was a predator adjusting his frame. Quietly, naturally, like he'd never forgotten how, Derek didn't notice, or maybe he did and didn't want to believe it. Finally, he said, clapping once, let's give the man his moment. But no one clapped, not anymore. The air had turned. James remained silent. His eyes scanned the room once briefly, not challenging, just taking inventory, reading the space, measuring, calculating. A tall student near the back leaned toward the boy beside him and whispered, that stance. I swear I've seen it before, in Vegas, at the MMA Nationals, 2003 or 2004. The other student frowned. You mean Silent Storm? Yeah, the tall one replied, eyes narrowing. That was the name. Sarah heard it. Her skin prickled. It wasn't confirmed, not yet, but she knew. It wasn't the name that convinced her. It was the stillness, that terrifying, patient stillness of someone who didn't need to act loud to be dangerous. Derek stepped forward again, oblivious, still thinking this was a performance, still thinking he was the one in control. But the mat knew better, and soon, so would he. The circle closed in without anyone saying a word. 8 students, spaced evenly around the mat, phones tucked away, eyes locked on the 2 figures in the center. Derek bounced on his feet, shaking out his arms, a theatrical grin plastered across his face. He looked like a man warming up for a seminar. James, by contrast, didn't move. He simply stood there, still, quiet, breathing with the calm rhythm of someone waiting for a train, not a fist. The contrast was unsettling. Derek clapped his hands. Let's keep it light, just a demo, no hard feelings, he said, chuckling, but no one laughed this time. Even he could hear it, how flat his voice sounded against the silence. He circled slowly, throwing a few shadow punches in the air, showboating for an audience that wasn't cheering. Anytime you're ready, champ, he said. James didn't respond, didn't flinch. Derek stepped in, quick jab aimed at James's shoulder. The punch missed. James hadn't blocked it. He hadn't even raised a hand. He had simply shifted, not much, just a breath's worth of movement, but the fist found only air. Derek blinked, stepped back, then came again, this time a 2-punch combo, jab, cross, fast, trained, tight. James moved again, his feet gliding across the mat like water skimming stone. The first punch sliced past his chin. The second missed his ribs by inches. Still no contact, no retaliation, no reaction, just movement, controlled, precise. Derek's grin faltered. He darted sideways, tried a low kick. James pivoted, his footwork silent. Derek's leg cut through empty space. Around them, the room held its breath. A whisper floated from the back. He's not even trying. Sarah stood still, watching intently. She saw it now, the micro-adjustments in posture, the weight distribution. The economy of motion. James wasn't reacting. He was predicting, reading Derek's shoulder tension, his hip placement, his tells, and dismantling him without lifting a finger. Derek, flushed and breathing faster now, charged again. This time more aggressive. A flurry, hook, jab, uppercut, elbow. The crowd couldn't even track the sequence, but James wasn't there. He was always a second ahead, not dodging, flowing. By the time Derek finished his sequence, his body was off balance. His stance too wide, his breath uneven. James tilted his head slightly. You lead too much with your right shoulder, he said softly. The words hung in the air like smoke. Derek froze. He hadn't expected commentary. James continued, still not striking. Your footwork's heavy on the heel. You give up center every time you reset. Another pause. You're not sparring, you're performing. That's the difference. Derek growled, humiliated now, his pride strung more than his body. He launched again, faster this time, desperate to land something, anything. It was a reckless charge. James didn't back up. Instead, he stepped forward, just once. His right hand lifted slowly, palm open, no fist. He placed it, not slammed it, not punched, just placed it gently against the center of Derek's chest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Derek flew backward, as if struck by something far greater than weight or muscle. His feet lifted off the ground. His body arched through the air and crashed into the mat with a thud that shook the silence loose from the room. No one moved. Derek lay there, blinking at the ceiling, chest rising and falling like he'd just run a mile. He wasn't hurt, not physically, but his mind couldn't make sense of what had happened. Sarah felt her heart in her throat. It hadn't been flashy. It had been surgical. One student, phone half hidden behind his arm, had recorded the entire thing. The angle caught James's posture, Derek's charge, the impact, the silence. He didn't post it yet, but he would, soon. And within hours, it would ripple across forums and feeds like a quiet bomb. On the mat, James offered a hand. Derek stared at it, then looked away. The circle around them stayed frozen because something sacred had just happened. And for the first time in that dojo's history, no one could pretend it hadn't. Sarah's hands trembled as she unlocked her phone. The screen lit up, white-blue glow casting across her face as her fingers flew across the keyboard. She typed the words like a question. Las Vegas MMA Nationals. Silent Storm. James Washington. The results loaded in seconds. Dozens of articles, archived footage, photos of a younger man with the same eyes, same jaw, same quiet intensity. The headlines read like echoes of a life no one in the room had imagined. Five-time world champion, undefeated, walked away at the height of his career. She swallowed hard and lifted her gaze. James Washington, she said, voice quiet but clear, also known as Silent Storm. The name hit the room like a low-pressure front. No thunder, just that dense, rolling stillness before everything shifts. One student gasped. Another took a step back. Even the fluorescent lights above seemed to hum differently. Derek, still sitting on the mat, blinked. His chest heaved with the effort of catching his breath, but his voice came out barely louder than a whisper. Silent Storm, I had a poster of him in my room. The words were fragile, childlike. He looked at James not with anger now, but with the crumbling reverence of someone who just realized the man he tried to humiliate was a legend he once admired. James didn't flinch, didn't nod. He simply looked at Derek with calm, steady eyes. Then he spoke. If you had known who I was, he said, voice low, would you still have spoken to me that way? Derek didn't answer, couldn't. And if not, James continued, then ask yourself, have you ever really respected anyone, or just the titles they carry? The silence that followed was deeper than before. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't fearful. It was reflective. It was the sound of mirrors cracking in people's minds. Sarah looked around. The students, the mat, the mop in the corner, it all looked the same, but nothing was. Something fundamental had shifted, because it wasn't just about James anymore. It was about what he revealed. The truth that power without humility is nothing, and that character isn't earned by belts, but revealed by how you treat those who carry none. James didn't wait for applause or validation. He had never needed either. He turned slightly, gaze sweeping the faces that had once laughed, now silent. In that moment, he wasn't a janitor, and he wasn't a fighter. He was the reminder of what strength is supposed to be. 3 months later, the old vinyl sign above the entrance had been replaced. The letters were simple, carved into a dark wooden plank that looked like it had seen wind and rain. The Dojo of Humility. Beneath it, the door swung open to a softer rhythm. The energy inside had changed. It was quieter, but not lifeless, intentional, focused. Derek Mitchell stood near the entrance mat, sleeves rolled, watching as 3 young students wiped the floor in steady motions. No complaints, no sarcasm, just silence and care. He didn't shout commands anymore. He demonstrated, slowly, patiently. One of the students asked why they had to clean before class. Derek paused, then answered the way he'd been taught. Because if you don't learn to respect the mat, he said, you'll never respect what happens on it. At the far end of the dojo, James Washington stood beside a small stack of training pads. He wasn't wearing a belt, no gi. just a grey long-sleeve shirt and dark pants. His presence was calm but undeniable. He was no longer the janitor, nor the ghost of a legend. He was something else, something more rooted, a quiet pillar. Sarah approached him after class, a notebook tucked under her arm. Her research thesis had taken a turn, no longer just about discrimination in sports. Now it was about redemption, about how power redefined itself in the absence of ego. "Thank you," she said simply, "for teaching me the difference between silence and submission." James smiled, soft and brief. "You taught yourself that," he replied. "You just needed someone to remind you it was allowed." They stood together for a moment, watching as the students lined up their shoes with more care than most adults gave their taxes. "The atmosphere is different now," she said. "It's like something was lifted." James nodded. "Arrogance takes up a lot of space. Do they call you master yet?" she asked with a smirk. James shook his head. "I told them not to." "Why?" "Because titles are heavy," he said. "And I don't need one to be heard." She looked puzzled for a second, then thoughtful. "So what do they call you?" James glanced toward the mat. A student was helping another tie his belt correctly. "James is fine," he said. "But before anyone learns to punch," he added, "they spend 1 hour each week cleaning the floor." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Mandatory, non-negotiable." She smiled again. "That's going to confuse a lot of people." "Good," he said. "Confusion leads to questions. Questions lead to truth." Outside, the wind picked up gently, rustling the new sign above the door. The Dojo of Humility didn't advertise. It didn't need to. Those who walked in were there to learn something deeper than footwork. They came to study under a man who had nothing left to prove and everything left to give. James watched the students with steady eyes. No belts, no hierarchy. Just people learning to move, and more importantly, learning to stop. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.